So thank you very much for coming this afternoon, taking time out of your lunches. Nice to see some friendly faces here, and both new and old. So we have two wonderful guests today, and I'll keep my introduction short so that we can hear more from them than me. But the long and the short of it is, what we wanted to talk to you today, the last 6 years, Russia's post-election political economy, which is co-sponsored by the Foreign Policy Research Institute, is basically what we don't usually hear about on the news. What we hear about on the news is all this stuff about Russian foreign policy. It's all very exciting. It's all very, what will Putin do next? We see war in Ukraine, we see war in Syria, we hear about the poisoning of former Russian intelligence agents in England. It's all very, very exciting. And these are the things that President Putin loves to talk about. He loves talking about geopolitics, realpolitik, nuclear weapons, all this sort of stuff. But inside of the country, there are many more issues at hand. And chief among them, Russians are just like any other group of citizens. They want to live better next year than they live this year. And part of what any president should do is to generate economic growth. But what we've seen in Russia is sometimes this economic growth is a little bit turbulent, sometimes it stagnates, and there are a lot of essentially questions, why does this happen? So to help talk about these issues, we've brought here at Daniel Morgan Graduate School, we brought together two experts on the Russian political economy. Sitting to my right and your left is Martin Gilman, and he is the professor of economics and advisor to the rector at the Higher School of Economics in Moscow since he retired from the International Monetary Fund after 25 years in 2006. From June 1993, he was the advisor from the IMF Policy Department on the negotiating missions in Russia, and then moved to Russia in November 1996 as head of the IMF's Moscow office. So when we hear a lot about what was the Russian economy really like in the 1990s, we have an actual participant in those events. It wasn't fatal for everyone, let's put it that way. He returned to Washington in 2002 as assistant director in the policy department, where he was responsible for sovereign debt issues and was the IMF's representative to the Paris Club. And the Paris Club, that's sort of an organization that helps coordinate public debt or sovereign debt at the highest levels. He's author of the book No Precedent, No Plan, Inside Russia's 1998 Default from MIT Press. And sitting to my left is Chris Miller. He is the assistant professor of international history at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University. He's also the director of the Foreign Policy Research Institute's Eurasia program. And if I could self-aggrandize for just 1 second, Chris has been the wonderful editor of a Eurasian political economy series, and he invited me to be the author of one of these reports. And so we recently published Running in Place, the latest round of Russian economic modernization. And Chris's office was very kind to send me 50 hard copies. So if you're interested to see the reason I'm hiding in my office all day, is for things like this. Chris's research examines Russian history and political economy. His first book was called The Struggle to Save the Soviet Economy, Mikhail Gorbachev and the Collapse of the USSR. And this was a very interesting book in that it basically, one of the things that we know about, let's say, China's economic modernization is that in the 1970s and 80s, they opened up their agricultural markets. And suddenly, whereas it had gone from collectivization and total embezzlement collapse in the 50s, 60s, and most of the 1970s, the Chinese economy started growing quite a bit. And so the question of that book was, were the Soviet authorities aware of what was happening in China? And were they doing anything to try to replicate it? Because the economies were pretty close. And what Chris's book shows is they were very aware, and they were very unable to do anything about it. And so I think that's why it's called also The Collapse of the USSR. Chris's latest book is called Putinomics, Power and Money in Resurgent Russia. So in terms of what are the low and high points of Russian political economy of the 1980s, 1990s, and basically the forever period since late 1999, we have two great experts. So what we'll do right now is I'll turn it over first to Martin, and he'll speak for a few minutes, and then we'll transition to Chris. So Martin, please go ahead.
Okay, I'll sketch just a few generalizations about the Russian macroeconomy over the last couple of decades. compared to our experience of the 1990s, with maybe some allusions to what's currently going on in the macroeconomy and why. The main point that I would want to stress is that, ironically, in retrospect, you could contend that the Russian economy has been performing almost as an ideal pupil of the IMF. If you look at the economic policies that have been implemented since 2000, I'm not saying that they always follow specific IMF strictures, but broadly, if you think of what IMF recommends to its member countries in terms of keeping fiscal expenditure under control and making the public debt sustainable, lowering inflation, building up reserves, both fiscal reserves and foreign exchange reserves to keep, to have in case of need, should there be unexpected fluctuations. Two very key things that the Russians did in the last 2 decades is at the time of the 2013-2014 crisis in Russia, they allowed the ruble to float and thereby insulated the economy from enormous pressures for a significant loss of reserves and devaluation. That floating exchange rate has served them extremely well. It is something that they did not do, contrary to the IMF's advice, in 2009 after the 2008-2009 global recession after the Lehman Brothers crisis, where they tried to, for a while, protect the exchange rate. Although even at the time, which the IMF didn't quite appreciate then, because Russian corporates and banks, like many emerging markets, had taken advantage of low interest rates in the United States to borrow excessively. And they had excessive foreign debt at that time. And had they allowed the ruble to depreciate precipitously at that time, there would have been widespread bank and corporate bankruptcies almost immediately. But they took a loss of almost $200 billion in reserves between 2008 and 2010. But they're not repeating that mistake again. So another orthodoxy from the IMF that they have followed is based on Kudrin's advice in 2004, adopted by the Kremlin administration, was to create an oil fund, to create a buffer between world prices and the budget. And again, when the economic downturn took place in Russia in 2014, those buffers were extremely important, and even more so in a sanction regime where it's much more difficult for Russia to access international markets. Although, and maybe Chris will talk about that, but the recent $4 billion Russian bond issue, which was a big success, that came just the end of the week after the Theresa May's intervention in Parliament about the Salisbury incident, was ironic, and the Gazprom bond flotation at the same time. And ironically, with mostly majority of the foreign investors were British and American. So it's very interesting that you've got this political dimension, but the economy keeps going on. So I would just stress the fact that they have allowed exchange rate flexibility, they've built up fiscal reserves, they now have a fiscal rule or budget rule that assumes that the oil price in 2017 was $40 a barrel, this year $41. Everything that comes in above that price goes into the oil fund and doesn't touch the budget. So they're operating, they're doing like Indonesia and some other oil exporters. They're learning the lesson, and they are basically creating a buffer between the international oil price and the domestic economy. And that oil price assumed for the budget is low enough that unless you think the oil market is going to go very fast down to $20 or $30 a barrel, it's probably realistic. And so, point here is that the IMF looks at Russia and they say, this is very good macroeconomic policy. I just saw an advisory by Deutsche Bank this morning that said, despite sanctions, Russia its macroeconomic policy is doing splendidly well. I don't know how to reckon. I'm not a political scientist, so I'm not going to comment on how this happens, but those are the facts. Anyway, I'll leave it at that.
Okay, thank you. And sort of one clarification. So when Martin was describing this fellow, Alexei Kudrin, which I'm sure Chris will also talk about, this is a person who was the longtime finance minister of Russia in the 2000s, and whose name is sort of a byword for liberalization, reducing the capacity of the state in the economy, increasing the ability for market actors to do stuff. So it's sort of libertarianism, let the market work. But thank you for that. So we have something on Russia being, that's I think an ideal IMF pupil. So some rare praise, at least on that. So let's turn it over to Chris.
Well, let me actually pick up right where Martin left off on how was this possible? How did it happen that Russia was able to implement the macroeconomic policies that Martin sketched out, in which I agree completely conform with orthodox economic recommendations, and then after that I'll turn to the ways in which Russian economic policy over the past 20 years have done a good job at producing economic growth and the ways in which they've been less effective. And I think you had a change over time where in the early 2000s policy was more targeted towards solving Russia's biggest problems, and since that point there's been less of an ability for the government to actually solve the problems that are inhibiting economic growth and inhibiting growth in incomes. But first the question of how did it happen? How was it the case that after a disastrous financial crisis that accompanied the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, and then again a second disastrous financial crisis that accompanied the collapse of the ruble in 1998, and in between, in that 7-year period, Russia suffered gargantuan budget deficits, hyperinflation, a series of economic dislocations. How did it happen that immediately afterwards, when Putin took power and the current elite took power, they were able and chose to implement a policy that is in fact quite what we would call conservative in kind of the American or the Western definition of macroeconomic policies, of having low budget deficits, having low inflation, and being willing to tolerate the social cost of those policies in the short term. And one of the key reasons is that in the 2000s, the first decade of Putin's time in power, is that Russians were on the whole quite satisfied to have stability compared to the instability of the 1990s. So although the government wasn't doing much actively to help the population in terms of increasing social spending, although it did increase pensions, the focus was just on providing stability. And stability was a fair trade in most Russians' views compared to the 1990s. Now, over the past decade or so, Russians have begun to demand a little bit more from their government, but not actually that much. So even though the government's policies have been less focused on increasing incomes, and indeed income growth has slowed quite dramatically since the rapid growth of the early 2000s, nonetheless, there's been surprisingly little popular pressure on the government to increase income growth. So for example, the policies that Martin described after 2014 in letting the ruble float, or maybe letting the ruble sink might be a more accurate analogy, because it fell quite sharply against the dollar, and therefore drove up the price of imports, which are denominated in dollars, and drove up the inflation prices overall, and drove down the inflation adjusted value of Russians' wages to the extent that in 2015 real or inflation adjusted wages fell by over 10%, and final figure was 12% that year. There were almost no complaints from Russians through the political process. Now, if you had a 12% fall in American real wages, we would all grab our pitchforks and march on Congress. But in Russia, that didn't really happen at all. And you can debate as to why that was. Why didn't Russians complain in any sort of organized fashion about the collapse in real wages in 2015, and to a lesser extent in 2016. Some people point to, again, the memory of the 1990s, when in fact things were quite chaotic, when incomes fell by even more than they fell in 2015, and so by comparison, things still didn't look bad. That's one explanation. The second explanation is the structure of the political system, that Russians are afraid to protest because of repressive measures that might be part of the story. A third explanation is that Russians culturally are used to hard times economically. They survived World War II with terrible losses. They survived the 1990s. And some people point to Russian culture as inuring people into tolerating bad economic outcomes. I think there's probably something to all three of these arguments, but the net effect was that from the government's perspective, there was no demand to increase incomes. And therefore, if you're sitting in the Ministry of Finance or in the Duma or in the Kremlin, and the population isn't telling you that they want rapid increases in incomes, or that a 10% decline in real incomes isn't really that much of a problem, then from the perspective of a political elite in Russia, why would you turn to dealing with that issue? And so as a result, Russia's political elite has not turned to addressing that issue. And so since 2014, but even before that time, there's been relatively little income growth and relatively little cost imposed on the political elites for providing such limited income growth for the average population. And so from the elite's perspective, they've managed to do something which very few countries can pull off effectively, which is run a very conservative macroeconomic policy, have macroeconomic stability, and couple that with low income growth and manage to stay in power. It's easy to do those two things and manage to lose power. When voters kick you out of office, when you have a revolution against you, Russian elites have managed to stay in power despite that. And so one of the big questions looking ahead towards Putin's fourth term as president, the next 6 years, which should be, according to the Constitution, his last term as president, is will this continue? Will Russians remain relatively quiescent, tolerating economic growth that's at a lower level than many European countries, lower than the United States? Will they continue to tolerate real incomes fell again last year? Inflation-adjusted incomes fell last year. Will this continue to be palatable to Russians? They'll decide that this is something that they're not happy about, they'll accept. Or will you have more pressure placed on the government to perform, to provide some sort of higher living standards? And if it's the former, then Putin is sitting pretty, because it's relatively easy to manage an economy where you face no pressure for higher wages. That's pretty straightforward. But if you do start facing higher pressure for the government to increase incomes, either by getting the economy to grow faster in aggregate, or to increase pensions, and a large share of Russians depend almost entirely on their state paid pension for their income, then suddenly there's more challenges because you have limited funds and more demands to spend those funds. And so I think that's a key question for Russian politics, but also a key question for Russian economics going forward, is what will the demand for higher wages and higher incomes be? And if that demand increases, how does the government deal with it? And one of the dilemmas that Russia faces is that it's not easy to raise incomes. This is not only true in Russia, it's true in aggregate. It's difficult to get economic growth. You need good policies coupled with good luck, and you can't guarantee good luck, and good policies aren't always that easy. As Martin pointed out, Russia's done a pretty good job in the macroeconomic policy front. There's been low inflation, there's been stability, low budget deficit. So the question of macroeconomic stability has been provided. On the microeconomic front, the question of regulations and property rights, Russia's had a very different record. In this sphere, the regulatory state has barely improved at all since the 2000s. There's widespread demands for paying bribes if you're a business trying to get your fire permit or your sanitary permit for your restaurant. Property rights are regularly violated, not only at the top levels of Russian politics, where major oligarchs have billion-dollar assets seized from them in totally concocted judicial cases, but also at the lower level, where small business owners have to fend off raids by local police or local government organs. And so this discourages investment. If you're a Russian business person and you can invest in Russia and maybe have a 10% chance of losing control of your asset, or put your money in Switzerland and have a 100% chance of retaining control over your money, this encourages people to invest more in Europe and less in Russia. So you might ask, well, why doesn't the Russian government change that and have a better regulatory system, a more security, property rights atmosphere? But that's politically challenging for the government, because a lot of people who are very powerful in the Russian political elite have benefited from existing schemes that waste money, reduce property rights, security, and add to corruption. So for example, if you look at the largest Russian state-owned enterprises, firms like Gazprom and Rosneft, by accounts that are widely cited in the Russian press, including by the most credible Russian newspapers, these firms waste on the order of billions of dollars a year via contracts that are signed with former judo buddies of President Putin. And so you could say, well, why don't you just stop giving contracts to President Putin's former judo buddies? But of course, these are the guys who control, or at least influence, the political process in the Kremlin. So if you actually wanted to improve the investment climate in Russia, you would need to tackle some people who are extraordinarily close to the president. So it's politically costly to do that. And so that's the dilemma that Russia's government faces today. So long as it doesn't face demands for higher incomes, things are fine, because everything's already working from that perspective. Stability is guaranteed. Putin's in power, the elite feels secure. But the moment people start demanding higher incomes, income growth above negative numbers where it's been the past couple of years or above even just 1 or 2% a year, then you have tough choices to make because you either need to find a way to make the economy grow faster, which means by taking on some of the corrupt interest groups that have destroyed the investment climate over the past decade or two, or you need to put at risk the conservative budgetary policies that Martin has sketched out. And I'll just end on one note about pension policy, which might seem rather obscure, but in fact it's at the center of how the Russian government has managed politics for the past 20 years. I mentioned before that almost all elderly Russians, the retirement age is above 60 for men and 55 for women, and almost all Russians of that age, with a tiny exception, depend for the state guaranteed pension for almost all of their income. So the amount the Russian government pays out in pensions is extraordinarily important. And pensioners, like in the United States, go out to vote. So if you want to have a stable political system, you must make sure that your pensioners are happy. And Russia, like many countries, has an aging population. It hasn't saved enough for its pensions over the long term, and so there's extraordinarily strong demands from the finance ministry to cut pensions or to raise the pension age, which does the same thing. But from the perspective of the population, that would be an extraordinarily damaging move because people depend on pensions getting paid out at a relatively young age and at relatively high levels. So if there are demands to increase incomes, the government will naturally turn to pensions as it has before to win support from the population. But at the same time, that will put more pressure on the budgetary situation that Martin has sketched out, which has served Russia quite well over the past 20 years. So that's a core dilemma, I think, that stands at the center of Russian politics over the next 6 years and even beyond. It's, will the demand for higher incomes increase? And if so, how do you provide that? And that's a dilemma that the Kremlin is hoping to not have to address, because if it does have to address it, there's not yet a clear plan in terms of what to do.
Okay. So I know you'd like to respond to that, so, but let me also use my privileges as a person already speaking. Because there's one sort of question that I had that's sort of central to Chris's top discussion, and which also goes into yours, is that you've described Russia as being an ideal pupil of the IMF. And one thing that Chris has described is that to this point, it is a very stable macroeconomic country, and they've been able to withstand, let's say, more acute political or economic demands. But the question I've always wanted to ask you is, one of the things that the Russian government always says is this period of the 1990s was total apocalypse, it was total bedlam, and that essentially when President Putin, in the 2012 election, this is before Crimea happened, without any serious challengers, he had to effectively run against the 1990s. So in a sense, how do you sort of evaluate, is this a fair criticism of the 1990s and international actors, or essentially are you willing to sort of accept that, perhaps all these international NGOs are just like the whipping boys for contemporary politics? How do you evaluate that the policies are still in place, but the politics of them have gotten much worse?
Okay, well, the specific answer to why it has continued is because the same economic team that went through fire during the Russian default are still in place. I've always said that as long as the president keeps the same broad, there are people, Silovanov was a young guy in the ministry under Kudrin, but it's all the same group of people. Elvira Nabiullina, the head of the central bank, the former economy minister, but she was in the economy ministry as first deputy minister back during the 1998 crisis. Sergei Ignatieff, who became head of the central bank after Primakov left, after when Putin became president, he was the first deputy finance minister during the 1998 crisis. These are people who had their hands on the gears at the time of the meltdown. And they're not going to let it happen again. They've seen it. So they are very persuasive with the presidency in terms of arguing about any slackening of economic policy. Now, in terms of the blame game, well, sure. Everybody is going to blame the people who were there during the 1990s that allowed this to happen. My humble view of the fact is that there was absolutely no alternative. I remember having arguments with Jeff Sachs in the Metropole Hotel about that when he said, there should be a kind of a Marshall Plan for Russia, to save the economy. The fact is that the Soviet Union was so bankrupt, and Chris knows this very well, that the Soviet Union was so bankrupt, there was nothing left. So that simply letting the controls go led to hyperinflation, whether it would have been Gorbachev, whether it would have been Yeltsin, anybody else, the economic circumstances were dire. The country was totally bankrupt. So it's easier to blame the people who were there.
Can I put one fact on the table in that regard?
Sure.
So in 1991, the Soviet Union had a budget deficit estimated around 30% of GDP.
Wow.
So that makes Greece look like a paragon of property development.
Trying to just train ruble. Can I ask you though a question, Chris? When you talk about, because I think it's fairly standard to say that economic reforms have been ignored and nothing is really happening on the ground. But I'm mystified. I mean, the World Bank came out with its new Doing Business report, and Russia has gone, if you look at the trajectory, Russia has gone from 124th rank of about 190 countries in, say, 2010 to 35th place this year. And, I mean, you can look at the specific categories, but, some of them are much worse, but overall, 35th place in World Bank Doing Business. So something is going on there. I mean, I live there, and so I know all these stories about all these crazy things, but there must be something going on for the World Bank to change so abruptly its view about the ability to do business in Russia.
So I would say two things in response. First is that in Georgia, which is a small country south of Russia, they did the same thing basically 10 years earlier, a huge jump in their in the World Bank's ratings and the ease of doing business. And the way they did that was they looked at how does the World Bank measure the ease of doing business. To a certain extent. Not that that's unfair to do, because the things that the World Bank measures are in fact important. How easy is it to get electricity hooked up to your business? How long does it take to actually register the documents of starting your business? But if you want to just get up the rankings pretty rapidly, you can just focus on the dozen or so most important things, fix those, and then you'll go up the rankings. And so one of the critiques that's been levied against this particular metric is that it doesn't have a very good measure of security of property rights. And so if you're, again, a big Russian business person looking to decide where should you invest your next 10 or $100 million, do you invest it in Russia or do you invest it in London? The security of that property right is extraordinarily important. And I'll just give you one example. It was 2013, I think. There was a trio of Russian oligarchs who sold half of a joint venture with BP, the big oil company, a joint venture called TNK-BP. And so these Russian oligarchs ended up with a huge windfall, tens of billions of dollars. And they had the choice of where do you invest it? Do you invest it back in Russia, or do you invest it abroad? And it might not surprise you that a number of the Russians involved are now owners of very large energy assets in places like Germany. And so that's a dilemma that Russia faces, so long as people feel like it's safer to invest money elsewhere, especially at a time when Europe is growing just as fast as Russia is. So there's no reason to expect higher returns in Russia per se. It's going to be hard to attract investment, and so that will limit the long-term growth potential.
Could I add something to that point, just as an illustration? Same thing, that ever since my involvement in Russia macro policy, going back 25 years to 1993, when I was first assigned in the IMF as a policy person on the team, I always looked at money demand, ruble money demand, M2 divided by GDP, nominal GDP. Because it is the one really significant indication that, and you can't really trick it, you can't game it like maybe the World Bank is doing business. The fact is that the Russians do not trust their own currency. They never have, and even though we're now in 2018, and inflation is down to what? You saw the last month's figure, 2.2% on an annualized basis. The demand for ruble money has still not increased. Russians do their banking offshore, which is your point. They do their investments offshore. When Alexander Voloshin, a former chief of staff of the Kremlin, was assigned by Putin to pursue this initiative under Medvedev to create an international financial center in Moscow, I remember myself and maybe a few others were joking to them, well, you know, if you can figure out why Russians won't do their banking business and financial business in Moscow, why they don't want their salaries in rubles put in a Russian bank account and into Russian ruble assets, you may have an answer to why foreign investors have tribulations about this kind of thing. So even though ruble money demand has increased broadly over the last 10 years, it is still way below the kinds of numbers that you would see, say, in Eastern Europe, or even in a country like Kazakhstan. It's really surprising.
Interesting. So let me ask you, Chris, one sort of quick question before we turn it over to the audience. So one of the themes of this book and a lot of your, let's say, recent writings, you've compared Putin to Leonid Brezhnev as a person who had essentially a very stable economy and sort of society, but essentially that the bomb was coming, the bomb was coming from inside, and so that as soon as essentially Brezhnev left, his successors had to deal with the years of stagnation, in which different policy options could have been taken when the country was much stronger, but they weren't because that would have interfered with the stability itself, leading to Gorbachev coming in, to use contemporary language, coming in to disrupt the Soviet economy, and that ended in tears. So if we, let's say, take as a matter of, take your assumption that Russia is stable, but that there is stagnation, this could go on for probably a number of years. Essentially, how would Putin's successor, whenever he or she comes in, how would she deal with basically the Gorbachev problem?
It's a really big dilemma, because I think I agree with the way you framed it, that the longer you let problems persist without dealing with them, the harder they become to deal with.
I think that's also true in life.
True in life, too. I mentioned the pension example, which is, again, not a sexy example, but it's huge in terms of the size of the Russian economy. If you raise the pension age today, you'll have a much smaller problem than if you raise it in 10 years or in 20 years, just because the numbers get larger and larger. And that's just one example among many. If you were to implement growth-enhancing reforms today, you'd have a much larger economy in 10 years, with which you could tax it more and have more money to address problems in the future. So the fact that that's not happening in any number of ways, and there are very intelligent Russian analysts who are pointing out the ways in which the government could make changes, but is declining to do that for political reasons. And Alexei Kudrin, for example, the former finance minister, has a reform plan on the table for President Putin's next term about what he should do to change the political system, the economic system, to get more growth. I think that's probably going to be largely ignored. But the fact that that isn't being dealt with now does in fact leave larger problems on the table, and it's not even pensions is one, that's a financial question, but also education is another one. Russia's actually decreased education spending over the past couple of years, which has been good for the budget balance, but probably not good for the long-term status of the Russian labor force. If you're looking to attract higher skilled jobs, it's hard to imagine declining education spending as a share of GDP being a positive thing. So all of this does suggest to me that I think Russia is storing up some long-term problems, and it's of course not unique in that sense. Many countries do that, we do that in any number of ways, but it does suggest that whoever comes after Putin, whenever that happens, is going to face a more challenging political environment, just because the problems will still be there, but they'll be more acute, whether it's in 6 years or after that point. But whoever comes after Putin will almost certainly have less political capital to spend, just because Putin's been there for a long time. He has a track record. His approval ratings are extraordinarily high, and you can debate whether they're actually 80% or closer to 70%, but whatever they are, they're high. Whoever comes after Putin will not have a 70% or 80% approval rating, so it'll be even harder to push through reforms, especially since almost all reforms have winners and losers. Even if there's more winners than there are losers, losers complain a lot, understandably so. And so if you want to change policy, you've got to have the political capital to spend on reforms. And it's hard to imagine the next Russian president having more political capital than Putin, which means it's hard to be optimistic about positive reforms after Putin. But it's also hard to be optimistic about reforms during Putin too, so that's an optimistic view.
So we'll see that the next person won't have the emotional connection after 25 or 30 or however many years of service. We'll have to deal with a lot of problems, and it'll look like that'll be the guy who caused the problems.
Yeah.
So let's turn over to the audience. So when you ask a question, please identify yourself, speak clearly for the benefit of the panelists, and Make sure that your question has a question inside. Okay, so we'll go with Harley, and then I see 2, 3, were there other hands? 4, 5, 6, okay.
Thank you. I'm Harley Balzer from Georgetown University. And I guess, Martin, I'm sure you've seen Kudrin's articles talking about the change over time. Between 2000 and 2008, they got about $900 billion of hydrocarbon revenue, and the economy grew at a little under 7% a year. From 2009 to 2017, they got $1.3 trillion in hydrocarbon revenue, and the economy grew at about 1% a year. The macro indicators both times were really pretty good. That didn't change. Something happened. Either this model is defunct, or the corruption got a lot worse, or something. And when I do my work on Russia and China, when I put up the macro indicators, they're almost identical. They both look really good. When I put up the micro indicators, Russia looks like a bottomless pit, and China looks like a world beater. So what Chris is saying about this, what else can they do in a time when the winners are not going to go away easily?
That's a great question, and I'll answer in two parts. One about Mr. Kudrin's recommendations and specifically what they could do with reference to the experience in other countries. About the this differentiation between the first decade of the 2000s and more recently in terms of economic growth rates and the oil price. I've always had a problem. In talking to people to try to explain that let's not confuse apples and oranges, okay? In economics, when we're talking about real quantity, like real GDP, it's different from talking about an oil price, which is a nominal concept, okay? And I have great difficulties both with Russians and my own compatriots when I travel in terms of explaining the difference between real and nominal. Because if the oil prices are higher and there's more revenue coming in, does not necessarily mean that there's not a causation with real growth. Real growth is caused by real factors. Growth of the labor force, labor productivity, new inventions, real investment. Oil is, now if you increase oil production, yes, that's a real factor, that's real. But oil price is not real, it's nominal. Now, you can go into secondary causes because if you increase nominal prices and you increase revenues, well, somebody's going to get that revenue, unless you're doing now with the budget rule where it's put into the foreign exchange market and doesn't affect anything inside the Russian economy, which is what they started doing in 2004 when Kudrin introduced the oil stabilization fund. They were effectively taking those much higher oil prices that were coming in and putting them into fiscal and foreign exchange reserves. So that's one small part of it. But you could say, well, it did increase budget revenues, and those budget revenues allowed the government to expand expenditure enormously, and of course that's real. You expand real expenditure, that's a way, and pensions, as Chris mentioned, those are ways that it does come into the real economy. But the fact is that those secondary real inputs through the back door, through pensions and higher government spending, was not productive. It's not productive spending. They were not encouraging private enterprise. Times were good. They didn't need to. They had, so I think that in a nutshell, they could afford to be prolific because there was no pressure. And we've seen that in a lot of emerging markets. I mean, we saw that in the Asian crisis. I mean, you're on to a good thing. Some people could say that under Mr. Trump, that's going on here too. So it's kind of a human nature in the Russia, and I agree with Chris, they're not going to deal with it until they have to. The second, just very quick part of this is that there's a recognition that economic diversification for its own sake does not necessarily enhance growth. The World Bank had a very interesting study about 3 years ago on economic diversification worldwide, looked at various country models, and it's very interesting that trying to diversify doesn't necessarily increase economic growth. What might be the model for Russia, and I would contend, is probably more the Canadian, Australian example of resource-based economies that have not become, they've become more diversified, obviously, but Canada and Australia are still relatively resource-based. But what they've done is brilliant, because they haven't diversified in terms of economic sectors so much as they've diversified, you might say, in terms of the way productivity is enhanced through investment in education, social services, fostering e-commerce, and all kinds of micro efforts that the governments have made that also allowed, even in the resource sector, both upstream development and downstream development. They started exporting these kinds of services.
This is the right so to start.
Right. And the Russians are, to some extent, kind of picking up on that on this, current fashion about localization.
All right, very good. So let me move on to this gentleman and then that gentleman.
Tom Peacock, retired member of Congress. Russia is a huge place, and I'm sort of following on your answer to the previous question. Are there islands or differentiation in economic development, or if you were looking at Russia, would you invest in the former Finnish part of it, or is some area near Moscow where the economy is robust? Or, it can't be the same in Siberia as it is in St. Petersburg. There must be a big difference in property rights and all that, depending on the different regions of the country.
Well, right, a great question. Just a very short answer to say that yes, it does vary tremendously, and I think it varies not so much because of economic conditions, but political conditions, as I understand them. This terrible cinema fire last Sunday in Kremlin. If you look at who the governor is there, it's a holdover who, I'm not going to say too publicly what I think, okay, but just to say that these things happen under that type of administration. It's a throwback really to the 1990s, and it's abysmal. And you would not, as a foreign investor, want to invest in his oblast. But there are other oblasts that are run by governors who are young, dynamic. In fact, one of the new things which is emerging in the Kremlin, which gives me some hope for the post-Putin era, is that under Sergei Kiriyenko, who has been brought back into Kremlin administration, they now are, they've been shuffling the governors, trying to do it fairly quietly, bringing in younger, talented people, and giving them KPIs. Can you imagine giving governors KPIs? But you perform, you do these things. And it's starting to make a difference in other areas of Russia. But unfortunately, there are places where they have old holdouts, and it's very corrupt, and you would not want to be doing businesses there.
Can you take some more questions?
Oh, sure. So this gentleman.
Yeah, Ken Meyercord. Two quick questions. One is the pension age in Russia, and the other is, a lot of attention has been given with regard to the new tariffs on steel and aluminum on the impact on China. But isn't there a major impact on Russia as well amongst the countries that haven't been exempted from the tariff? I think they are the largest exporter of steel to the United States, and China hardly exports any to us. And it's the third largest supplier of aluminum after Canada and China. Have they threatened to retaliate?
Sure. The pension age is, I believe it's 60 for men and 55 for women, so fairly low compared to US or Western European standards, although not actually that low compared to other countries in Eastern Europe, although everyone is in the process of
Actually, it's
increasing.
higher for men than for women.
Okay, reverse
Men
it.
are 65, women are 60.
Is that right? Okay, maybe it's higher than I thought. The second question was steel. Yeah, it's certainly true that that steel tariffs are going to hurt a couple of Russian firms. I haven't looked into that in great detail, but no, they haven't threatened to retaliate.
Okay, so let me go to the gentleman with the red tie behind, with the blue shirt and red tie. Yes, you, with the glasses.
Okay, thank you very much. But English, IFC. So I'm glad to hear IMF orthodoxy in this analysis, because you use two key elements of old-fashioned IMF approach. It's monetary policy and fiscal policy. But now, in updated formula, IMF more and more pay attention to structural reforms. You mentioned some things about structural issues, but not sufficient from my point of view. Because we are talking about future, what may happen during the next 6 years. Am I right with the topic? But this analysis is mostly about past. And I don't agree with some conclusions or some remarks made by Martin. I apologize. For example, you said about this real and nominal approach. But we see not only correlation, but causality of oil growth and GDP growth in Russia. In 90s, in early 2000s, and even now. Because this rebounds, rebirth, or whatever, resumed growth happened only because oil prices increased significantly. Significantly. Then you missed very important changes which happened in Russian economy. The share of state monopolies. They increased dramatically. You can't ignore this factor. It was 35% in Russian GDP, state-owned sector, in the early 2000s when Putin came to power. Now it's more than 70. And in banking sector, we can see maybe more than 80 or 90% in foreseeable future, just in a couple of years. My forecast that we will see the bankruptcy of half of existing Russian banks now. And structural reforms. You mentioned this name, Kudrin, but he's focusing on this. It's about not only pension policy, it's about federalism, about governance, it's about budget. When we have military expenditures and security expenditures, it's more than 40% of budget. How we expect what can be growth, driving source of growth? You mentioned this expectation of demand of higher salaries. It's idealism, it's illusions. We saw that in previous couple of years, one of the drivers of growth was agriculture. Because of external factor, because Russia could export grain, and it was a driver. But this source is exhausted now. We saw that in previous period, one of the drivers of this growth was mega project, World Cap, Crimea Bridge, and other things. Now we cannot wait that these temporary factors can impact on Russian growth. So what really can stimulate Russian economy? Because macroeconomic stability is an important factor, but it's not a driving
So we have the issues, what might be done?
Sorry.
Let's deal with it. What is to be done here?
I have no idea.
Good.
I mean, you have to leave it to the private sector and business and,
What private sector?
that's a problem.
What I think is worth thinking through.
There
so-
it is. There it is.
Yeah, so I agree with what Vadim said. I mean, I think it's important to understand why it was the case that the share of the state increased from 35 to 70% GDP, and why it's unlikely to return, which I think is probably a bad thing for Russia, but that's the reality, is that the people who are in charge of some of the biggest state-owned companies, which are responsible for the increasing share of the state in the economy, are extraordinarily politically powerful, more powerful than the demands of people like Lexi Kudrin for these structural reforms, and so you're not going to have a privatization of Gazprom or Rosneft, because the people who run them benefit from the fact that they're state-owned, the fact that they can be run inefficiently for the benefit of politically powerful actors are going to retain power. And so as long as that's the case, you're going to have the state play at least as large, if not a larger role in the energy sector. In the banking sector, we've definitely seen that in the economy overall. So I'm with Vadim that it would be great to see structural reforms of the type that would make state-owned companies more efficient or even privatize them, but I'm unfortunately not optimistic that that's going to happen.
So we'll carry on, but just one sort of key point to get sort to this question is, when Martin earlier mentioned that governors have these key performance indicators, KPIs. Although Russia is a federal country, governors aren't elected. And so essentially, when the governor is trying to make his political constituents happy, his political constituents aren't the people of his region, but essentially the people who appointed him. So in effect, we have political incentives which aim towards maintaining stability and the status quo and some of these issues that we're seeing. So let's turn over to the gentleman to the right.
Yeah, John Mueller from Ohio State in Cato. I noticed if there's been a Crimea effect. If Crimea hadn't taken place, the sanctions presumably would have been there, and the loss of confidence, which is not very high already, but outside would not have happened. But the oil price problem still would have happened. So if that's the case, Crimea hadn't happened, but the oil price did have the problem. What would Russia look like today? Basically the same, better, worse, what? Economically.
Well, in my humble view, I don't think the sanctions, direct sanctions, have made much of a difference. Here within the Beltway, we like to think that it's a big deal, but in reality, it's not. But the effect of the change in climate and the attitudes towards Russia, without this direct sanctions themselves, have had a chilling effect on new investment. I mean, there are European and especially American businesses that are reluctant to get involved with anything Russian simply because it might have some negative spillover, either through their shareholders or stockholder activism or other reasons, regulators, etc. So there is that effect that probably has had some economic impact. But I would think that really it wasn't really so much Crimea, it was really the oil price that has really affected Russia. And in some ways you could say salutary, because high oil prices have always been problematic to get anything, talk about reform. When oil prices are high, you cannot get any reforms of almost any kind in Russia. It's low oil prices that means that the amount of resources that are available for wider distribution are limited. And so there's going to be a lot of fighting over that. And they're going to have to be economical in how they deal with that. So I think that lower oil prices, I remember Kudrin always saying that low oil prices is a blessing to the Russian economy. It's the only hope to increase productive investment. Because in the end, the people in the Kremlin do understand when they have their backs to the wall, and if there's no choice, they're going to have to relent on the economy and block some of their friends, because there's no other hope. The demographics are not in Russia's favor.
Maybe one point on how the government has responded to sanctions.
Yeah, sure.
This actually fits into the question about the banking system as well. I agree with Martin that the oil price collapse had far more important economic effect than the sanctions, although the sanctions really have had some effect in deterring investment. But what's been interesting to watch is, especially in 2015 and 2016, right after the sanctions were first implemented, the way in which the Russian government, the Russian financial system stepped in to plug the funding gap of Russian firms that were previously borrowing lots of money from Western capital markets and now were unable to do so. And one of the things that you saw in those 2 years, 2015 and 2016, was that very rapid expansion of a couple private banks. Kremlin Bank, for example, which went bankrupt last year, and these banks expanded extraordinarily rapidly with the kind of support from financial regulators who knew what was going on. And what these banks were doing was lending to firms that were under sanctions, or firms that were dealing with firms that were under sanctions, taking bad debt on their books. And then in the past couple of months, a number of these banks have since gone bankrupt, leaving the bill with taxpayers. And so there's been essentially a backdoor bailout of firms that are under sanction. It took several years, and it happened through the banking system, so most Russians can't actually, unless you follow the details very closely, you don't actually know that it's happening. But there has in fact been a government bailout of firms under sanctions, just done through the banking system.
So Vanessa, so we have the lady here. So just like one quick thing. So part of so Professor Mueller was asking, in the counterfactual universe in which the Crimea didn't happen, was there any sort of possibility that this could have been, with the collapse of the price of the ruble, because of the collapse of the price of oil, that this could have been some wonderful half-off sale for like the Russian economy? That essentially that this would not have induced some sort of larger investment boom into the country?
I think it looks pretty similar, different on the margin, but pretty similar.
Pretty similar, I would agree.
So let me ask the lady here.
Sure, Representative Williams, CFAS intern. I have two questions. The first one also has to do with the last tidbit that you mentioned about the bailouts and how that, might affect regular people, since it seems like it will probably have to come from the budget that they have to pay all of that back. So I wonder, I think I remember seeing some articles on pensioners who went out to protest in Russia. Is the government looking at what's happening with Navalny and these pensioners, and then perhaps there could be some kind of agitation from the fire that happened with governors who are maybe not be taking care of their people? Is the government thinking about that? Will Putin be thinking about that? Will all of this affect, in some ways, his policy towards the finance sector and regulations, whatever? And my second question has to do with the role of the Eurasian Economic Union. Does it play any kind of role in the macroeconomic policies of Russia and just in general?
Sure. On the first question, the political question, certainly the Kremlin is interested in following Navalny closely and making sure he doesn't get too popular. This is a anti-corruption campaigner who's since become a very influential politician, though marginalized. The thing that has protected the Kremlin thus far is that Navalny has managed to rally support in a variety of different cities across Russia, but mainly from young people, not necessarily people who are already politically active, but relatively young, and he hasn't been able to tap into support from pensioners in a serious way, for example. And if he were to do that and establish a political coalition that crossed not only regional boundaries, but also age boundaries, that would be extraordinarily powerful and dangerous from the Kremlin's perspective. But thus far, we haven't seen that, and so I think the Kremlin feels like they've got this under control from their perspective. On the Eurasian Economic Union, my view is that there's two different drivers of the Eurasian Union. One is economic, the other is political. It's clear that the political driver is still in place. I'm not sure that there's actually much interest in Moscow's side in actually deepening that union in economic terms.
I would agree with Chris. Just on your first point, just to add one little note, not related to Navalny, but the Russian blogosphere is exploding with reactions to fire Iran. I mean, just exploding, and there could be political consequences. I mean, you may have a managed democracy or whatever you want to call it, but the Kremlin is certainly sensitive to public opinion. I mean, I think we're attention. And so going back to what Chris was saying, it'll be very interesting to see how they try to manage this extreme discontent and just fury about what's happened. And I think that there will be a shakedown. It might even affect the composition of the new government after Putin is sworn in.
Okay, so unfortunately, Martin has a previous engagement at the IMF where I'm sure he's going to receive instructions to take back to Moscow. So please join me in thanking Martin Gilman and Chris Miller.